Welcome everyone to Maximizing Cloud Efficiency with Data Integration, AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure, the big three we'll be looking at today. I'd like to introduce you to our team. We have Dan, Richard, and Dami presenting today. I'll pass things over to Dan to introduce himself.
Hey everybody, my name's Dan. I'm on the customer solutions team here at SAFE. So we focus on helping our customers get the most out of the FME platform.
Hi, I'm Richard Mosley. I'm on the FME Flow team, and we help install FME Flow and get it working in people's environments. And with me is Dami.
Hi, I'm Dami Abasa, and I'm also part of the FME Flow support team, helping customers and people also troubleshoot and install FME Flow and get it working efficiently.
Awesome, thank you all. We also have Steve joining us on the back end here this morning. So if you do have any questions that come to mind during the webinar, please do leave those in the questions tab on the bottom right, and Steve will be able to help us out there. And we should also have a few minutes at the end remaining so that we can look at a couple questions live as well. All right, before we dive in here, a reminder of our Peak of Data Integration Conference coming to Seattle, Washington, this May 6th to 8th. If you have yet to apply to present, we encourage you to special speaker right there. So the deadline is November 29th. If you are new to using Livestorm, this is the platform we're in right now for our webinar today. If you have any audio or video issues, please click that help button on the bottom left for 4 simple steps to take. You can share your emoji reactions with us during the webinar using that react button on the bottom middle. We do have a poll coming up shortly. Awesome, yeah, people are already using that button there. So under the polls tab on the bottom right, keep an eye out for that poll. You can keep letting us know where you're tuning in from in the chat as well. And then questions, that's where you can drop any questions you might have. If you'd like to download the deck and follow along with that download live, you're welcome to just use the download button on the top right of the PDF. All right, with that, I will ask if our presenters can turn off their webcams just so we can save on some bandwidth for the remainder here. And I'll pass things over to Richard for our agenda.
Hello, welcome to the webinar. So today we're going to start with an introduction. We're going to talk about components of cloud-based workflows, what the options are there, and then we've got an Azure integration demonstration, and then we jump into an IAM role demonstration that kind of goes a little bit deeper, how we can integrate. We've got deployment options, we've got real-time in the cloud, and then using cloud services for FME, where most of this is using FME for cloud services. And then we're going to wrap things up with a conclusion and look at some resources and have a Q&A period. First poll is, where are your resources? Are they in Azure Cloud, AWS, Google, or on-premise? If you guys can poll in, we're interested to know what systems we're working with here.
Awesome. So if everyone wants to head on over to the polls tab on the bottom right, I've published it there now, and you can place your vote and let us know. All right, the votes are coming in now.
We'll jump into the introduction here. So FME works with your cloud ecosystem so you can get more out of both. And data is in the cloud these days, so we want to put FME in the cloud as well, so you can process close to your data. But we can also take advantage of the ecosystem and what's in the cloud to help FME and help FME be a bigger player within that ecosystem or that cloud. So what options do we have to enable FME to work within the cloud? Well, we've got some broad categories. We've got transformers, we've got readers and writers that we can specify in the workflow or the workbench to create those connection points. And then we've got a slight twist on that, which is the data stream. So FME Flow allows a data stream, which is continuous stream of data coming from potentially one of these transformers or in your system. So if you know that you have a need for continuous data, that is something that FME can handle. The other options are triggers and automations. So triggers can be an event like a file being dropped in a resource, or it can be a notification message broker system, or it can just be a schedule. So there's options there to start off your workflow. And then the REST API endpoints. FME has a robust REST API, and you can make these calls from anywhere. You can make them to submit jobs. You can submit automations, workflows, and you can also take the REST endpoints and move packages and projects through. And then lastly, we've got the DevOps tools for continuous integration and continuous deployment. So continuous integration would be a project where you're moving it from your dev to test to production, and your continuous deployment would be where you're deploying FME in automated fashion so you can have easier upgrades. So these are the different points which we can use the cloud solutions to help with FME. So what it might look like in a workflow, and this is a hypothetical workflow, and we'll get into it a little bit more in detail later on, but you might have a trigger such as an Azure event grid. From there, FME would then be triggered to run a workflow, or we'd be pulling data from a blob storage and putting it into Snowflake. And then from there, we can either send up more notifications, streams, Azure Bus, something like that, and then an Azure event grid. So if you have a pipeline and FME is in the middle, you can have a Azure event grid on either side, and you can kick off the next task if you want. FME also deploys almost anywhere, so you have the versatility of putting an engine directly in your cloud, even if you want the control plane to be somewhere else. There's a huge variety of installation types and ways to do it, so there's flexibility for your environment. And then today we're going to talk about some broad concepts here. We're going to say how can FME shine as the all data integration platform in the middle of this environment, and then how do you leverage FME to do more in your cloud environment, and lastly, how can that cloud environment do more to help FME? For those new to FME, Enterprise Integration Platform is basically two components. FME Form, where we author the workflow, we create those connections, and then we push it up to FME Flow, where we can enhance those workflows, we can schedule them, or we can respond to triggers. We also have FME Flow hosted, which is FME Flow hosted by us in our environment. We won't go into a lot of detail about it today because we're looking at putting FME Flow in your environment and how we can utilize it best there. And I'll pass off to Dan here.
All right, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so before we go into some of our demos, we're just going to take a little bit of a look at the different components of cloud-based workflows. And this is more so to do with how you work with those cloud-based workflows in FME. So I just want to start things off. For anyone who's new to the FME platform, hasn't seen it before, isn't familiar, the main things that we're going to be talking about today are transformers. This is a high-level overview of our FME Form components, where you have your readers and writers. That's where your inputs and outputs. That could be a flat file. It could be a database table that you're reading and writing to. And then in between, you'll have your transformers. So most commonly, when we're working with cloud services, we're going to be using transformers. So on FME Form, for our cloud integrations, we have a wide array of integrations for Amazon, Azure, Google, and others such as Snowflake, Databricks, and even more. So we have lots of different transformers that allow you to connect to your different cloud services and perform your different operations. If there's something that we don't support through our native transformers, there's always the HTTP caller, which allows you to perform custom REST API calls. So there's the Microsoft Graph API, there's the Amazon Web Services API, and as well as Google Workspace APIs. I might be missing some here, but the idea is that if there's something that we don't currently support, you can always customize your HTTP caller to perform those API calls. And if there's really something that you want us to support, always feel free to add an idea to our ideas page in the community. We also have a great resource there for getting started with APIs if that's something that you're interested in. On the FME Flow side, so FME Form is where we author those workflows. So that's where we're going to be building out those workspaces, where we place those transformers, and we can work with our cloud services. And FME Flow is where we deploy those workspaces and automate them. So in terms of automation triggers, this is how we can use our cloud services to trigger events and trigger an FME Flow automation to kick off a workspace that we published up to FME Flow. So you could imagine an example, which I'll show in a second, where a user drops a file into their blob storage browser, and a trigger picks up that message and then kicks off a workspace which can process that message and maybe enrich the data, download that file, or do other operations. On the other side, we also have external actions. So these typically finish off your automations. So you could upload a file to an S3 bucket, you could notify an SNS topic, or you could notify an Azure Event Grid topic, or send a message to an SQS queue. And we can also use APIs, Azure Functions and AWS Lambda, and any other functions that are out there to trigger FME's robust API. So what we're talking about here is the FME Flow REST API. We have a wide array of different endpoints that you could use. So you could use these to trigger automations, trigger jobs, scale your engines, or move projects around if you have multiple different instances. So let's take a deeper look into Azure integrations. We're going to be taking a look at an example of integrating between Azure and Snowflake. So really the goal here is to streamline data integration between the Azure Blob Storage and Snowflake. Right now, we don't have any native data integration capabilities between Azure Event Grid and Snowflake, which is where FME Flow comes in. We can use FME Flow and leverage the Azure Event Grid trigger to kick off a workflow and connect the two together. The result is a fully automated integration between Azure Blob Storage and Snowflake. So let's go take a look at the demo. All right, so to kick off this workflow, we're going to be dropping a file into our blob storage. Go grab that file, and we'll click upload. Now, once we've uploaded that, that's going to kick off an Azure Event Grid event, and that's going to trigger our automation that we've set up in FME Flow. So I can go over to FME Flow, and I've got an automation set up here, a pretty simple one. We have our Azure Event Grid trigger on the left, and we have our workspace in the middle. So once our Event Grid message is received, that'll kick off our workspace. And if there's any failures with the workspace, then we'll send off a notification email. I'm going to refresh the event counts, and you can see our number changed from 4 to 5. So that means we've received a new message. And we'll expect that Azure Event Grid, or this workspace here, has been kicked off from the Azure Event Grid trigger. If we go into our table here, so the whole idea is that when that file is being dropped into our blob storage, that'll kick off our workspace, which will then pull down that file, enrich it, create point geometry on it, and then upload that to a Snowflake table. So I've just pulled up our Snowflake interface here, and we're just in the copy history, and we'll click refresh. And you can see 1 minute ago, we just loaded in 30 new rows. So that was pulled straight from that CSV file that we just dropped into our blob storage. So what does that look like in our workspace in FME form? As I mentioned before, the automations is just one part of our workflow. We have our automation set up, but really what we need to set up first is our workspace here. So let's take a look at that. In our workspace, I've used a parameter fetcher to pull in the message coming from the Azure Event Grid trigger. If I click on this, we can pull up that message. Let's format it for JSON. I'll just zoom in so it's a little bit more visible there. And this is just an example of a message you might get from Azure Event Grid. The main thing we're looking for here is our URL attribute. And what we want to pull out from this is the name of that file that was just dropped in by the user. So right now in its current state, this JSON isn't really useful since we need to parse it out for these different attributes and their values. We can use a transformer called the JSON flattener. We have various different JSON transformers, but this is the one I'm using in this example. But there's no wrong or right option. But we're using the JSON flattener here to parse out those attributes. You can see when I click on the feature cache here, so this is essentially viewing our data as it passes through our workflow. And we can take a look at our table down here, and you can see we've parsed out all our different attributes and their values. I've got our URL attribute now parsed out. And what we need to do now is pull out the name of the CSV file that was dropped in by the user. The bulk attribute renamer is just going to remove the prefix on our attribute names, and then the attribute keeper will just clean things up. The string searcher here will then extract the file path using regular expression. So in here I specified to search in the URL attribute, and we've just specified a regular expression. And you can see here when I open up our feature information window, and I'll just pull this up so you can see a little bit clearer. We have our path attribute, which contains the name of our CSV file. Next, in our Azure Blob Storage connector, we've passed in that path attribute as the file that we want to download. So we've set up our web connection. We've set the action to download. We've set our container that we want to download from. And instead of using and hard coding in a file name, we've instead used our attribute value for the path. The next step here, after we've downloaded that file to a temporary directory, is to use the feature reader to read that CSV file itself before we load it into Snowflake. So you can see from our Azure Blob Storage connector, we've got this download path attribute, and that just contains the path of where that file was downloaded. And again, we can use our attribute values in our different transformers to dynamically download or read different files. In this case, we've just set it to a CSV reader. And again, instead of hard coding the dataset, we've selected our attribute called download path. The next steps here are just to create our geometry and set our coordinate system before writing that out to Snowflake. So we've just done that with the vertex creator, which uses the X and Y attributes to create that geometry. And then the reprojector here is able to reproject our data. And once we reprojected it, we can see it's in the correct coordinate system and the correct location. And then in our feature writer, we've just set it to write out to our Snowflake table. So you could use a regular Snowflake writer here, or you could use a feature writer. It's really up to you. The advantage with the feature writer is if you wanted to perform any additional actions here, such as maybe you want to send another email, or you want to send information back to Azure, then you can add in additional transformers and connect them up to the summary port here from our feature writer, and those will run. So we'll just go back into our Azure blob storage, and I'll just show off our event. So with our automation, when we create that trigger, it provides us with a webhook URL. And you can see here for our event, I've set it up with that webhook URL down here. So that's how we're connecting the two together. When we create our event in Azure Blob Storage, we then can provide it with the URL coming from our FME Flow automation. In here, I've also specified the event type. So I've specified just to use blob created, but there's many different ones here. And then I've also set subject filtering, and this will just narrow down that message for when blobs are created in this specific container. All right, let's hop back into our slides. So from a high level, here is our workflow diagram. On the right there, we have our Azure Blob Storage container. And when a new file is uploaded by a user, that passes through the event grid message to FME Flow and triggers an automation. Now that workspace that we published to FME Flow executes and synchronizes the new records to the Snowflake table. And that data is then loaded into the table, and users are notified if the workspace fails. As I mentioned, we use the Azure Event Grid trigger in this case in our FME Flow automation. One thing to keep in mind is that FME Flow must be configured for HTTPS if you are using the Event Grid trigger in order to pass that information back and forth. And as I mentioned, in blob storage, we've configured the event type for blob created, and we enabled subject filtering. So again, the subject filtering is just to narrow down when that blob created message gets sent through. If we didn't have that subject filtering set, we would get notified on any of our different containers when a file is uploaded. And again, this is the sample Azure Event Grid message that we just showed off. So some key transformers from the workspace that we were just looking at. The JSON fragmenter is a really strong tool. Whether you're working with webhook payloads or Azure Event Grid messages, it's a very strong tool where you can use JSON queries to extract attributes and values. The string searcher is another strong tool where you can use regular expressions to parse out information such as the file name. If you're not super comfortable with using regular expressions, there is the AI assist tool within the string searcher, which I found really useful. I use that for this demo. I find it's a lot quicker than trying to figure out the regular expression myself, so I just go ahead and use it, and it's been a great tool so far. The Azure Blob Storage connector allows us to download, upload files, or list contents, and we have various different authentication types. So I was just using a web connection there, which is an OAuth 2.0 web connection, but there's different authentication types, and Dami will be talking a little bit about those different authentication types with AWS in his demo. And again, in the automation, that Azure Event Grid message is received and triggers the automation through our Event Grid trigger. And we have our workspace in the middle there, the orange block, that extracts the file name from the event message, reads the file, and loads the data into Snowflake. And that email action notifies if the synchronization process fails. So really the key takeaways here is that we can use FME Flow to build reactive Azure Event Grid driven automations. This allows us to eliminate polling, and we can use FME to react to any Azure Event Grid event. So the power here is that we're not really limited to blob storage and detecting changes on a container. This is just a very simple example that I think paints the picture quite well. Wherever you can deploy those Azure Event Grid events, you can react to those with FME Flow. And I'll pass it off to Dami.
Hi, I'll be discussing more about the deeper integrations with IAM roles and basically just looking at the other secure methods that you can connect FME with AWS generally. So IAM roles like generally provide a secure connection from your FME to your AWS services. And in cases where you don't have, in cases where you're not able to use IAM roles, you could also experiment with environment variables. So all of this is just different authentication methods that you can use to connect to your AWS service without having to actually manually input your credentials when trying to use FME with AWS services. And yeah, so for this, the main goal is to utilize the S transformer, which is the S3 connector using IAM roles. This is essentially having your server that hosts FME connected to an IAM role that has the permissions to perform like the S3 bucket functions. And we're also going to be using an SNS transformer, in this case, to get a notification to say our job has been successful when we're done processing it. So in FME, the SNS transformer does not have the IAM connection, so we'll be using the system caller in this case, which would pick up the environment variables that we're also going to be testing in this demonstration as well. So this should just be for use cases where you're not able to use the IAM role. You could also use environment variables for a secure connection. Then we're also going to connect this with an FME Flow schedule, where you would have the job running at intervals in FME Flow. And the result will be a fully automated integration between FME Flow and S3, the S3 bucket. Yeah. So the FME Form workspace that we'll be exploring would use the S3 connector to pull out information from the S3 bucket that we have. Then we're also going to be using a test filter to sieve out information, generally just to be able to filter out the kind of file or document you want to be processed. Then we're going to download that file using the S3 connector again, and then process the job with the feature reader and the feature writer before finally sending an SNS update using the system caller. I'm going to show how that would work later on. So the key transformers in this case, the S3 connector. So in this case, you see the credential source, you have system, anonymous, web connection, embedded, and system. So in order to use the IAM roles in this case, you're meant to use the system credential source. So this inherits the permissions you've already provided to your IAM role. The permissions in this case would be the SNS and the S3 bucket connection as well. So this allows whatever server is hosting FME at this point to pick up that permission without having to specify any of that in FME itself. Then the test filter we're using in this case is just to check that in that bucket that we've already checked, we're only going to be picking out the CSV file that we're going to be processing in this case. Then the feature reader is going to process the CSV file using the download path in the dataset format so that we don't use any constant variables in the overall processing. Then we're going to use the writer to push that file to the temp directory, which is what we're going to be exploring in this case, and downloading that file to your local system. Then the system caller in this case is going to be used to send an SNS message when the job has been completed. So as discussed earlier, you have the SNS transformer that also performs this function, but with the SNS transformer, you would have to input your access keys and secret keys. And in some cases, you wouldn't want to do that. If you don't want to input your credentials, you could just use the system caller and then use the command line to input an SNS command to publish that the job has been completed. This is an alternative to actually imputing your credentials as mentioned previously. And then to get this working, you have to use the environment variables using the AWS CLI. Just provides you another option for a more secure connection to an AWS service. So we're going to be looking at this in a demo that we're going to have. Yeah, so this is the S3 buckets where it's picking up that CSV file. Then this is the temp directory where we're going to have that file processed into when the job has been completed. So that's the ctemp. Then we're just going to take a look at those transformers as repeated previously. So we have the S3 connector transformer. This point, it's looking at, you're going to have different options in the credential source. You use the system, as mentioned previously. Then we're going to use the CSV filter using the test filter transformer. Then in the S3 bucket, the second one, we're going to be using the credential source system to download to that temp folder. The action will be download. Then it's going to process the job using the feature reader at this point. And then the feature writer is going to have that result put into the ctemp folder before finally using the system caller and then pasting that SNS command in order to process that job. So in that command line, you can get different commands from AWS that you can use to perform different functions. In this case, it's just to publish a message. Then once that's done, you're going to run the workspace. Yeah, so that's a successful run. And then after this, we're going to publish this to FME Flow. In this case, you have the different options to add your FME connection. I already added it here. And if you wanted to, you click the connect to FME Flow, you enter your authentication information for your FME server so that FME form can connect to that particular server. Then what's going to happen is, because you're going to need the S3 package, automatically FME gives you that option to add the package there. Then you publish that particular workspace to FME Flow. And then once it's in Flow, you're going to see the workspaces in the directory that you had. In this case, it was the dashboards directory. Then you can run that same workspace here. And after that run, check that the job is successful, to viewing the details. Then we're going to look into adding this into a schedule to complete. So we'll go into schedules here, created a schedule called S3 schedule. And in here, you can set the intervals, how many times you want that job to be processed. In this case, repeat once every 1 minute. You can trigger that schedule. And then once that's done, click OK. Then once that schedule has been triggered, then you can also go here to enable that trigger at different points. You can also disable it using those actions. And once that's done, we should see that file has been added into that temp directory. And yeah, it's been updated. And you should get an SNS notification like this one. You'd see 2 new messages from the ones that we've shown previously, and all this worked using the system caller as well, and the inherited permissions from the IAM to get the information from the bucket. That'll be it for that demo. Then, okay, so our key takeaways in this particular demo was the FME Flow was able to pull files from the cloud service. In this case, that was the S3. And then the secure connections to the cloud services, which is using the IAM role, which you saw using the system option in the credential source, then using the environment variables, which is what we saw using the system caller when we didn't even have to specify any credentials and FME, and you could just have that set up in your environment variables using AWS CLI or whichever ones, the other cloud providers that you might be using. And then you can use multiple services within FME in your workspace, which is using the SNS feature and the S3 as well. So we're looking at other deployment options, and we're just going to discuss a bit about the other deployment options. So that's using the on-prem option, which is FME Flow and Form. And you could also use the multi-cloud hybrid, the containerized environment, Docker and Kubernetes. I'll talk a bit about that. And then fully hosted FME Flow on AWS, which is basically having your FME with our managed service itself. Then I'll also discuss a little bit about remote engines. So basically, remote engines just allows you to process other jobs in a different environment than the core environment itself. So using this diagram here, you can see the FME control plane and the local machines or the local engines are all working in the same local network. Then you can connect to other processing planes that's having other remote engines hosted on a different server, and then they're all connecting. So the other engines at different points would be processing other jobs, and they have that independent connection to your main core control plane in this case. And those engines could be located in GCP, AWS, Azure, different systems, but all of them have a connection to FME, but they'll be processed using the resources of other like cloud providers in that case, or other servers or different other environments as well. So just giving you that flexibility to have processing done in a different environment than your core system. Then I'll talk a bit about Docker and Kubernetes. So Kubernetes generally and Docker is basically a way you have your environment containerized, and then you have your different FME components in different containers and microservices generally. And then the advantage for most people would be the storage orchestration, automatic scaling. You can create your own replica sets as well with Kubernetes and using some of those Kubernetes commands. However, it's advisable you have the expertise prior to using Docker and Kubernetes generally, because it could get complicated at different points. But overall, it's a system that's utilized if you would like to have some of the features as mentioned previously, like automatic scaling and the points where you can customize your own application deployment in using your values file and managing your containers as well. And thank you. I'll pass it off to Richard to discuss runtime in the cloud.
Thanks, Dami. We're going to shift gears a little bit here. We spent a lot of time talking about what we can connect to in the cloud environment. We're going to talk about how you can connect to it in the cloud environment here with data streams. So we had a couple of workflows where we're looking at either event-based processing or batch-based processing. Batched is one of those things that happen usually on a schedule once in a while. Event might be something that comes up in less than 100 times a minute, and those would be able to be processed by FME through a message broker. And then we have data streaming, which again could be processed through a message broker, but it's a continuous workflow. So we have an engine dedicated and it's running all the time. We just want to highlight this because this might be part of your workflow. So as we said before, our automations examples we had show us how we can do that event-driven workflow. And then we've got streams on the other side. So we have functionality built in, and we can chop up the workspaces and have windows and process an ongoing stream of data. This is talking about high volumes of data here, millions of records with low latency. What it might look like in the diagram is where we have an IoT device and we go to Kafka message broker, which would live in your cloud environment. And then you can have a job that's listening to that and processing the jobs right away. Where the other side of that would have been what we saw before. We have an event happening and we're reacting to that event and running an automation or workflow based upon it. So there's lots of different connection points, and that's what we're bringing up. A lot of different cloud services that do message brokering and have streams that we can connect to. So that's how it may be a useful tool for you in your environment. We have a webinar on this if you're interested. So please click on the link. We'll be sharing out the slides later, and you can check out that webinar and look at the details on creating a data streaming workflow. So we spent a lot of time also talking about using FME and how it can connect to different parts of your cloud environment and react to things going on. But now we're going to talk about how we can have that environment help FME. So first question here is, do you have multiple environments here? So do you have a dev and a prod, or just a prod, or dev, test, prod? We'll want to know what kind of environments you're using here, and we'll pull that out here if everyone wants to go in.
All right, so we've got that there now.
Okay, move on here. So FME can interact with many cloud services, but cloud services can also empower FME, which is what you just talked about. So what are those ways? We have DevOps pipelines for project management. We also have the ability to automate deployments and upgrades of FME. So a DevOps pipeline would be moving those projects, which could be workspaces, automations, database connections, and moving them from your test environment automatically to your production or dev to test. And it also includes different ways where we can automate testing of it to a certain extent. So we have the concept of projects. We also have a bunch of other tools that exist, such as deployment parameters, that allow you to move these workflows around. More of an FYI, there's another link I'll provide later on another webinar that goes into this in more detail, and we have lots on the community around this. But the big connection point here is the CLI. So the FME Flow CLI, you can utilize in something like Azure DevOps to be able to move those packages or projects through your different environments and schedule the automated testing. So this is something you may already have in your environment, you may be using, but you can use it in a new way with FME here. And the second option here, thing we can do is deployments. So you can automate these deployments, especially in the cloud. It can be really beneficial to be able to create a workflow that's easy to deploy FME, so you can work on those upgrades. We have different templates on our website where we support Terraform, AWS CloudFormation, and Bicep, as well as Kubernetes. So these templates you can take, you can alter, you can adjust for your individual environments, and can create a deployment that makes it really easy for you to stay on top of the changes happening with FME. So distributed deployments can be quite complicated when we're talking about a lot of different permissions and networking involved, and that's where these ISE templates can come in handy. They can also come in handy with hard coding those resources in. So if you have a new database you need to connect to, often you'd have to open a port and then you'd have to note that you opened up a port. But if you can bake that into an ISE template here, that's infrastructure as code again, it's going to be much easier to redeploy the next time. So these easy upgrades can really help us because there are a lot of new features coming into FME on every build. And there's also a lot of vulnerabilities and security updates that you might want to take advantage of. And this process can really help. So it's a lot of upfront cost here, but hopefully it helps you in the long term. And it's just another point where your cloud environment can really help power your FME installation. So this is the webinar on it. So please click on the link. We'll share the slides out later, and you can look into that workflow in more detail. So wrapping up things here, we talked about different points where we can connect. So those are the readers, the writers. We're looking at triggers and external actions in FME Flow. We've got the FME Flow REST API, and we've got data streams as these connection points. We can also use FME or the cloud environment to take advantage of system permissions and really create an environment that is secure and robust for you. You can also deploy close to your data with remote engines. Deployment options are completely open, so you can put different engines in different environments to be specific to your data. And you can also enhance your deployment through the DevOps process. And that is our webinar today. We've got a lot of different users here. We've got over 29,000 community members, so please take a look at our community. We've got a lot of experience with 30 plus years. We're in 128 countries, and then over 200,000 users worldwide. And I'll pass off to Elizabeth at this point.
Awesome, thanks, Richard. All right, so I'll take us through a few resources before we head into questions here. Maybe we can also take a look through the poll results as well briefly if we have time. But yeah, for our resources here, the team has linked several that are specific to this topic on maximizing cloud efficiency. So please do check those out. Once again, you can download the deck directly just by clicking the button on the top right. You'll see a little download button there, and you can click through those links as you see fit there. As well, we do offer tons of free resources, and we also offer free instructor-led training over at our academy. So head over to academy.safe.com to check that out. And then also lots of upcoming and on-demand webinars I'll highlight as well. So register for those, take a look through the list. You can also search past webinars and see those on demand. In terms of next steps here today, we would love to help you get started. You can get in touch with us over at our info inbox, info@safe.com. We'd like to help you find any solutions to your data challenges there. You can also experience the FME Accelerator. It's 90 minutes free of charge. It's a great place to get started with the basics of FME. If you're a member of our FME community, as a thank you for joining us today, we do have a community badge code that you can redeem. I'll just drop that in the chat as well. All right, so it's RE2ZVQ. So head on over to the community, you can redeem that. If you aren't a member of the community, we encourage you to take a look. It's a great place to network with other users and experts alike there. Once again, the peak of data integration. Registration is open, and also our call for presentations for May 6th to 8th in Seattle. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time here now. I'll invite our presenters on stage, and Steve, if you want to join us as well. And we can take a look through the questions together. And maybe also we can chat a little bit about the poll results. I know we had a couple polls that had results trickle in later on, so I'm not sure if there's anything we want to chat about there. It's some great insight. So thanks everyone for voting as we went through.
Based upon the polls, it looks like we have quite a few hybrid users. So that's where the remote engine could come in handy, because you just need your HTTPS port open. You don't need anything else out, so it's easy to communicate with it. That was another question that came up.
Yeah, and I thought I'd answer Lauren's question live here, which was just related to the performance requirements and considerations. Yeah, thank you. That's what I was looking for. I couldn't put it up. Considering the local network and remote engines where they're hosted on the cloud environment. So for sure, network latency is important to consider. And so when you do this architecture, you're going to have a full-blown FME flow on your on-premise environment. That's going to have your core and your local FME flow database, the web Tomcat, the application server, all in that same network. What's nice about remote engines is you're really not dependent on much for network latency. You are deploying a remote engine on one of your AWS or Azure or whatever, a VM in that environment. And so now when you submit a job to the remote engine, you're just submitting a small request typically to the remote engine to do something. So yes, you will need something like a gateway to get that call out to be able to access the remote engines on the Azure environment, which you probably already have in place. But as far as what that remote engine's doing, that's intended to be local to the cloud environment there, right? So if you were wanting to be able to pull that data back to your on-premise environment, then that is where you're probably going to be doing something else after that remote engine job finishes to say, hey, this file is here now, sending an email, something like that has a link to this, say, FTP site or something like that, S3 bucket kind of thing. I hope that helps, and ask away more if there's more clarity needed on that. Anything to add there? Anybody else? Richard?
Sounds pretty complete.
And we do have some time for Q&A here for sure. Yeah. There was an earlier question too about the Azure Blob Storage Connector and support for managed identity. So this one here is, there's a few types of connections in the Azure Blob Storage Connector. Need a nickname for that one. Environment variables is certainly one where you could set up the account and secret key in there, and then that transformer when run on that system would find that information and use it to access it. And I do mention in the answer that I have played with the Azure Key Vault and the AWS Key Manager, if I'm correct, and both of those can be accessed using some Python. So you could have some startup Python in your workspace that could access those vaults and pull back information, credentials, and or keys and secrets to implement into your embedded connections of whatever connector you're working with. Typically, that's how I've played it out. So hope that helps. Yeah, that's all for me for questions. Anybody else have any questions coming up?
I guess we can look at the other poll there. To do with multiple environments, looks like a lot of people have that test dev prod setup, which is interesting to hear.
Yeah, I'd expect that to be pretty common, and it's definitely recommended. Really nice to have that test environment before you get to production. So that's a healthy way to go. And it isn't uncommon to see only prod in there with one FME Flow environment in the business, right? You just have to be a little bit more careful when you're doing your updates and upgrades.
Test dev prod is a nice setup too, because in your dev environment, you might be publishing through the workbench, but when you create the package and you move it across. Then you've got your test scenario where you're moving it across from dev to test, and then you know the exact same thing is going to happen from your test to your prod. So you've got that all packaged working from the first export.
Yeah. And I guess too, having that extra environment, when you are looking at an update cycle or upgrade cycle, you have that opportunity to upgrade your dev environment. And it does impact moving new stuff into your environments, but it does give you an extra environment just to get up and running with the new version before you move it to test and then to prod. So it's pretty common.
Got another question just thrown into the question panel here. I'll pull it up. Is there a plan to have Azure hosted FME Cloud?
That's a good one. I know years ago there was certainly rumors and discussions around doing something like that. And that's, you definitely please submit an issue or a ticket with us and or post a community idea. I think right now the answer would be that you'd be using remote engine off of an AWS Flow hosted would be the closest you could get to that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't think there's anything planned to do that right now, but I won't speak with authority.
And if you have some insights on why that would be valuable to you, that would be great, because it is still going to be hosted in our environment, even if we do host it on Azure. So you're not going to have the same sort of flexibility. So if there is still value in that, we'd love to know why.
Awesome. It looks like we have gotten to all questions at this point, but I'll just briefly note as well, if you do have any questions that come up after the webinar, we will keep things running a few minutes longer here. So feel free to get those in. And if we don't get to them live, we'll get to them in the chat or otherwise follow up by email. Any other questions that I'm missing here, team, before we wrap up?
No, I think we got to all of them today.
Yep, I think so.
Thanks, Steve, for taking care of those on the back end.
Fantastic. All right. Yeah, thank you, Steve. Okay, so I will just note, if you do have if you do have a moment to fill out our webinar survey, we really appreciate any feedback you can offer. It helps us improve our program. And just a huge thank you to our whole team of panelists here, our presenters, as well as Steve on the back end for Q&A. We really appreciate all your time preparing the content, Dan, Dami, and Richard. And thank you to our whole audience for joining us here today. We hope you all have a great rest of your days, mornings, afternoons, evenings ahead. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.